So we'll go back to that question and actually ask them, put them on the spot about that particular issue of definition, starting with Laurie. Okay, who are the hard to reach?
Okay, well, in our case, the hard to reach originally were teenagers. We were wanting to help the secondary school people with their mathematics. And we wanted to help them after school. So in contrast to what you did, we sort of bypassed the teachers altogether. And the children or the teenagers talked about Dr. Math to their friends, and we grew from that 20 to 30, from that 20 or 30 teenagers getting help with their mathematics to the 30,000 without actually involving the school system at all. So we originally thinking that it was the teenagers that were hard to reach, but as this word of mouth, this viral advertising happened for Dr. Math, more and more people who are perhaps more traditionally hard to reach came into the Dr. Math user group. So we would get kids that were at schools that didn't have math teachers. So in South Africa, math is required all the way up through grade 12. They have 2 streams, a technical stream that does, trig and beginning calculus, and they have a business stream, which is more financial. But many schools don't have math teachers. All right, so we would be helping those people. They would be considered hard to reach also. We would get kids that were in rural areas, kids that were on the taxis driving back and forth. So our definition of hard to reach has really changed. It started as teenagers and then became much broader as we got more and more users in.
Thank you. And Tim, you've already hinted at a slightly more complex definition as well.
Yeah, how long have I got now? I mean, I've got a whole range that I would add. I mean, I believe it must be clear from what I said earlier that those with disabilities are a huge group of people that we need to support. Why? Let me tell you a story. I was in an African country that will remain nameless, visiting a head of a special school for special education needs. And this was many years ago now. And he said, Tim, one of the biggest problems is when the children go home for the summer break. And naively, I thought, why? Surely they're with their family and home, and this should be a great time for them. They won't be away at the school. And it shows my naivety, because the head teacher said, well, when they go there, they're hidden away out of sight, sometimes in a corner of a hut. And we have to start again from scratch when they come back to school. Those with disabilities, friends and colleagues, so they may have just one disability, but otherwise they're as able as we are, and mobile devices can transform that so they can participate fully in our societies. I think, secondly, those at risk of living and working on the streets. If you're a street kid, what do you want to use your mobile phone for most? Actually, probably learning when the police are going to raid you next. But huge numbers of people, and we've been working with people in some African countries to try and support that. The elderly, I'm becoming, many of you might think I'm already completely disabled, but I'm becoming much more so. Huge numbers of people. As we get older, we need assistive technologies. I can't read the messages that come on my device if I haven't got my glasses. Hey, there's a huge market there for somebody. Let me stop there, but say, I think those who are hard to reach are those who we do not even think of. They're beyond our imaginations. There are many people who are hard to reach. Let's actually dream of how we can use these incredible devices that are so powerful. We don't use but a fraction of this power to support the lives of people who couldn't even dream about the place we're in. That is the challenge, and certainly that's the challenge that I want to lead my organization, the Commonwealth Telecommunications Organization, into in the next 5 years.
Thank you, Tim. I think Tim makes some important points. I said that what I think we've established over the last 10 years is to at least demonstrate that in many different circumstances we can use mobile technologies to take learning to people or communities, or to some extent even to countries where it hasn't been before. And I ought to have said maybe that how we now define mobile learning has been in terms of its capacity to cross contexts. And that's to some extent what you're alluding to, our ability to use these technologies to cross the boundary between informal and formal learning, or between school and home, or between parent and child. But I don't think as a community, as a research community, we've fully thought through the implications of that in the context of disadvantage and of development. So I think we need to get back to that and think more clearly and more rigorously about how we can then use these technologies in the context of the developing world. I think also it's very easy, for example, for me, but also for corporations, to use the phrase and the idea that we can use these technologies to help people at the bottom of the pyramid. That's something of a misnomer. The people at the bottom of the pyramid are the ones that actually don't own phones, so we shouldn't get too relaxed about our achievements so far. There are still people who are unreachable through mobile phones because they have no access, no ownership, no familiarity, no confidence with them. Anyway, sorry, and the next contribution, looking at how we actually define the hard to reach.
Yeah, so I think initially, actually, for my definition, it was also very child-focused. It was children, at the base of the pyramid that we were talking about, and it's changed a little bit. I still believe that the children, especially in the most rural areas of the world, are obviously very hard to reach, especially considering that they are not the ones with the cell phones in their hands. Typically, it's the father of the family, if anyone. But now I actually am more interested in looking at the adults, because I think that the adults are the ones who will be teaching the children, and I think that they are even harder to reach because there's no central place for them to go to convene on a daily basis the way that children theoretically should have a place like a school. And so I think they're even harder to reach often than the children.
Okay, thanks very much. And again, we're jumping backwards and forwards to some extent, and we're already hinting at the answers to some of the succeeding questions. But the next question, okay, if it seems to be, at least at first sight, an attractive proposition, we can use mobile learning, mobile technologies with the hard to reach, then actually what, Tim, your turn next, but what are the barriers and the constraints actually in reaching them?
Yeah, and again, I will just highlight a few. But before I do that, can I just go back to the previous question? I mean, there's been the sort of thorn between two roses. I was quite sure that gender was going to be mentioned by my distinguished colleagues, and it wasn't. So I think, drawing on experiences of one of my PhD students who's been working in an Islamic country, the ways in which some traditional patriarchal societies limit the use of women in actually accessing and using mobile phones is a huge issue. But also in other parts of the world. Again, my recent work in China, the men all had the great new phones, and they then had a hand-down phone of their old one to their wives. The daughters didn't get a look in, and one of the pleas that the ladies had was, God, a great thing you could do is put up a very simple training scheme that each village chooses one woman who would be trained in how to use mobile phones properly for learning, and then she could spread that information around the community. Such an easy thing, but nobody's doing it. Okay, what are the constraints? I think above all it's our own imaginations. If everybody in this room actually now thinks, okay, who is it who most needs? We don't need to be accessing our emails all the time, all the day on a BlackBerry or an iPhone. Who is it who can really benefit from this technology, and what are we each as individuals doing about it? If we don't change what we do, having been at WISE, being here is a waste of our time and a waste of the money and effort that WISE and Auditoire are putting into this. So our own imaginations. I think secondly, if I just address disabilities, everyone tends to see people with disabilities as a tiny market, and therefore the products that are made for them, the research that's done on them, is really, really expensive. But let's go back to what I was saying about increasing numbers of elderly people, all of whom, or many of whom's eyesight is going. The RNIB in the UK is beginning to do some fantastic work on actually how we can use mobile devices to help people with visual impairments learn. But we've got to get the prices down. Companies are, of course, interested in serving the largest markets. So global capital is a constraint on how we reach the poorest. But there are many companies out there who are deeply committed, actually, to expanding their involvement. Those of us working in research in these areas, civil society organizations, need to help them to reach the unreached. Clearly, infrastructure makes a difference. there are actually many parts of the UK where it's very difficult to get broadband access. So I can't access the web, which is probably the biggest learning device, rather than apps necessarily developed by teachers. But quite simply, in many parts of the world, electricity, connectivity, the functionality of devices. One of the great things China achieved more than a decade ago, 95% of Chinese villages had electricity. Now, chatting with China Mobile, 99% of Chinese people have mobile access. I find those figures staggering. If only all the aid that we had given to Africa in the last 50 years had simply enabled 95% of the villages to have electricity, what a difference that would make. I better stop there. I could go on.
So now we move on.
Okay, so in our particular case, we have very few barriers for teenagers wanting to talk to Dr. Math. Luckily, we didn't actually have to write any cell phone software. Mixit did all that hard work, and they work on pretty much a WAP-enabled phone. As long as you've got WAP, it doesn't have to be a smartphone with a little bit of Symbian there for you techies. They will have connectivity to Dr. Math. But our biggest barrier was getting the tutors on the other side. All right, so we're linking up people to people and the technologies in the middle. So we're not actually using the technology to deliver pre-made educational content. We're taking the kids and linking them up to the tutors. And it's a human to human, and the technology is just in the middle. So in the case of the Dr. Math project, the barrier, if we can say one exists, is that we have a shortage of tutors. And in fact, if there's any math professors out there, please talk to me after this debate. I can use some of your students. So in our case, it's a human barrier. It's not a technology barrier in the case of Dr. Math.
Finally, sorry, Shabnan, your view of the constraints and the barriers.
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of what Tim and Lori both said. I think when it comes to the different things that you've pointed out, Tim, like such as cost, infrastructure, web access, electricity, it comes down to kind of a hardware versus software issue, I think, which is, if we look at one laptop per child, for example, in my opinion, a total failure, and no offense to anyone who's worked on it, but I think the biggest issue was that it was a hardware, right? I mean, the software was also flawed, in my opinion, but the hardware was a new hardware that we're dropping into the hands of children. One, electricity obviously was an issue, the infrastructure and the cost. I mean, although it was free, I think, there were free. Yeah, to end user, right. And I think at the end of the day, also, it was a human capital issue, just like Lori said, right? The teachers were not well trained in order to use the laptop that they were given, or to fix it. And so I'd love to talk about actually one audience member who might be here is Hilmi, and he works with a company he started ZMQ. And ZMQ is really interesting because it's a software that's developing, it's a company that's developing educational games for a very low cost. He charges maybe 2 to 5 rupees per game, and he teaches people about AIDS and HIV issues. And I think it's just really fascinating what he's done to overcome these barriers that you guys have mentioned. So agree with them, and just wanted to give some examples of failures and successes.
Okay, so thanks. So what we have is a quite kind of fractured and not a comprehensive account of the barriers and constraints. There isn't something that needs a magic or silver bullet. It's actually quite a complicated and maybe kind of partial picture. That makes it quite challenging. We then thought we ought to go on and address maybe it's a fundamental question about why should mobile devices provide learning solutions? What's so good about mobile learning? And I think actually the mobile learning research community, I suppose, in some senses has been attempted to answer that question for the last 10 years, but in a rather maybe incomplete, possibly narrow kind of way. I mean, I suppose what we've established with myriad small-scale projects run with a subsidy is that we can deliver learning. It'll raise students' motivation, especially disenfranchised, disengaged learners. But we haven't actually addressed the wider questions about why mobile devices as opposed to more school libraries. So it's been a kind of inward-looking agenda, maybe, and we haven't addressed the question, okay, if it's so good, can we do it without a subsidy? Can we provide a business model or a sustainable model. So maybe we can look at those issues, but also, yeah, why mobile learning? Why so good? Why so appropriate?
So I think for me, there's a short answer and a long answer. The short answer is that mobile devices, as Tim has rightly pointed out, are no longer hard to reach, even for the hard to reach, theoretically. I'm going to throw out some little factoids for fun. I'm a nerd and I love factoids. So there's 7 billion people in the world, surprise, surprise, and 1.7 billion of those are in absolute poverty. And what that's considered by the World Bank is they don't have basic human needs: clean water, nutrition, healthcare, education, clothing, shelter, etc. 2.5 billion are in relative poverty, which is a little bit vague, but basically it says that they all have a lot less than what we have. And surprisingly, 5.3 billion mobile subscribers in our world today. 5.3 billion. That means that 1 out of every 3 people have their own mobile phone, and the rest at least know who to bribe to get access to a mobile phone. So that's 77% of the population, which I think is pretty incredible. And what that's telling us is that mobile phones are becoming ubiquitous, which I guess a lot of you already knew. And I heard a really interesting fact yesterday by one of the speakers named Francois Tadei, and he said that mobile phones are more powerful. Mobile devices are more powerful than the technology it took to get us to NASA, for NASA to get us to the moon, which I did look up and verify. And so, what does this mean? This means that this tiny little device, or maybe even Tim's tiny little old school device, has the capability to get me to the moon, but can it build me a rocket ship and put some fire under my ass to get me there? And I argue that it alone cannot. What I argue is that the foundation necessary to use technology as a learning tool can only be set by human beings.
Thank you, Laurie.
Okay, well, I'd like to actually just build on that. One of the interesting things we find with the tutors is that they often inspire the people, their tutees, the teenagers that they're talking to. So although our tutors sign codes of conduct that they're only supposed to talk about mathematics, we let them talk about other things about education. So they can complain about their teacher, and they can complain about that they've got an exam coming up. But they often wonder why they should stay in school. And this is talking about getting the fire under you. So we have this human to human using technology in the middle, and they're inspiring them. They're looking up for the kids. What are the requirements to go to university? What mark do they have to get on this exit exam in order to qualify to go to university? So why do we use mobile? I can only speak for South Africa. It's the only way we're going to reach the teenagers and the children, because they all have mobile phones. South Africa, most of the cell phone providers offer a 2-year contract. If you want to get a high-end phone, I can go get a 2-year contract. At the end of the 2 years, I keep my phone, and there's a very high giveaway rate. There's projects that refurbish the phones and give them away. There's a big secondhand market, and just about every teenager has a phone. In fact, for those of you who might know South Africa, there was research done in the Cape Flats area, very poor area, where they interviewed the children, the teenagers, and said, do you have access to a phone? And 97% of the teenagers said they had phones in some of the lowest township, poverty-stricken township areas. So everybody has a phone. So I like this idea of putting fire under them. So not only can we help them with their mathematics, but we can inspire them to pass mathematics and try to get into university.
Thank you, Laurie. Tim?
One of the troubles coming third is that you have to rewrite everything you're going to say. But let's not forget some basic, simple things. These devices are small, they're light, anywhere, anytime, more or less, provided you're in reach of your nearby tower. They're multifunctional. So all those things, fantastic, definitely help deliver. A couple of things I just want to pick up on. One is this point about being relatively cheap. One of the things that staggers me is just how much poor people spend on their mobile devices. I've got a colleague working a Finnish colleague working in Tanzania, and he recognizes that some field work he's been doing, and these figures are yeah, most people don't believe them, but he's a great researcher, so I do. But poor people are spending something like 30% of their income of any kind on mobile connectivity. That raises huge questions to me. What were they spending that money on beforehand? The value they place on communication, and actually getting some really good cost benefit of what they're saving and what they're spending. Certainly, again, with some of the rural farmers I was working with in China, one of them I remember distinctly saying, I couldn't do my job if I didn't have my mobile phone. I need to learn from that about markets, about products, inputs, outputs, and he said he would be out of business if he didn't have it. So these are definitely life-changing devices. I think something my colleagues haven't mentioned that I'd like to draw attention to is, and I guess it comes a little bit from my interest in working with people with disabilities, is voice, text, image, sense. These devices actually can incorporate all of our senses, and we need to do much more work, although there is some fantastic work going on about voice to text and text to voice, how we interpret images. So how can a person who is blind interpret an image on the mobile phone? And you can imagine that we could actually have some tactile elements to this, that could be developed into it. So I think that touches on something that is at the heart, and I would like to see changing. Far too much use of ICTs generally, but mobile devices in particular, to me, seems to be primarily on content. It's ways of accessing content. These devices are so much more than just that. They are primarily communication devices. And actually involving communication, be it through text, be it through voice, networks of learners supporting each other, is to me very exciting. And I would just like us to shift much more to using the communicative potential of mobile devices rather than just them as an opportunity to download or send content.
Yeah, and I think I'd underline Tim's point about the emphasis, the overemphasis maybe on content. I think it misses out the possibility of creating networks of learners able to discuss and generate learning rather than just to consume it. And I think that brings us on, certainly in my mind, to a further point that actually I'm not sure how much work we've done about the ways different communities learn, what it means within any particular community to know, to come to know something, what it is worth knowing, how you know it, who you know it from, and how you demonstrate you know it. And I think there's a risk, because these technologies scale up so obviously easily and have vast economies of scale, to assume that therefore that's the opportunity to broadcast content irrespective of its value or worth within any particular community. And maybe Laurie would say something about that in the context of young South Africans, and Tim might say something completely different about that in the context of Chinese farmers. But the point would be that they would all have, these communities will all have different perspectives about what is worth learning and how you learn it. And I think the viewpoint that these technologies can transmit content very, very easily, as I say, risks neglecting other possibilities about what the nature of learning actually is. So I'm glad Tim brought that up.